Well, it may just be time to panic. The World Health Organization has declared that the coronavirus outbreak in China is not a health crisis. I wasn't too worried about this whole coronavirus thing over the last few days because typically, whenever there's some sort of viral outbreak, the media likes to blow it out of proportion and make everyone think like they're going to die. You don't like with the Ebola stuff. And Ebola is a pretty scary virus. I read many years ago that book, The Hot Zone, and I don't know to the extent that that's really an accurate book, but it certainly scared me enough to be really afraid of Ebola. But it's not like there was any real chance that, everyone in America was going to come down with Ebola and, we're going to lose like half the population, like, the Black Plague style. And even with this coronavirus thing, there's only something like a couple hundred confirmed cases on a planet of 8 billion people, and like 6 people have died. And so I wasn't too concerned, but I was expecting this to be way blown out of proportion. But considering that the World Health Organization has declared that this is not a crisis and that they're going to wait and see how things turn out, that makes me nervous, because I would have thought that the World Health Organization would have jumped on this bandwagon and said, oh my gosh, this is the worst thing ever, we got to do something about it. But they're not doing that, which makes me think that it might actually be worse than we know, and that they're trying to calm people down. I know that sounds kind of crazy and conspiratorial, but I've learned that when it comes to any of these sort of government or pseudo-government agencies like the World Health Organization, it's best to try and take everything that they say and sort of assume the opposite is true. If you do that, on average, you'll end up closer to the truth than if you believed them 100% of the time. And of course, it doesn't help that when you have this going on, that all the governments of the world really are saying in concert the exact same thing. Oh, this is not a crisis. Everything's contained. There's no need to worry. People weren't saying that, I don't believe, about Ebola. Everyone, I remember back during that whole, mass hysteria event, were frankly hysterical. And, I know that's kind of a subjective thing to say, oh, well, are people more worried about this than they were about that? Yes, but I do think that this time there is a bit of a concerted effort to try and get the general populace to not worry about this. And frankly, that's not necessarily such a bad thing, considering that most of these, so-called pandemics are not worth worrying about because they affect so few people. The situation does seem to be worse than China is letting on. China keeps saying, oh, it's contained, but yet they keep having to announce that they're shutting down all travel out of certain cities in China, essentially quarantining millions and millions of people. I mean, Wuhan, which is where apparently this whole epidemic started, is a city of something like 11 million people, and they just decided to shut down all the highways and all the subways and said nobody's coming in or out. I mean, that's a pretty extreme measure, if I've ever heard of one. I think now they're up to like 7 cities in China that have been quarantined. Anywhere that this virus shows up, they want to seal everyone off. And perhaps you could say this is out of an abundance of caution. That, China is they're an authoritarian state, so they can get away with doing stuff like this. They can, if they find, one case of this virus, they can afford to take an abundance of caution because they have such total dominion over their people that folks are not free to move anyway. So China telling them that they have to stay in place and that they're not allowed to leave their city for some period of time isn't that radical of a move. But on the other hand, it may just be that the Chinese realize how contagious this is and how dangerous this perhaps is, and they're afraid of letting things get out of control, and that they might genuinely think that this is 100% necessary. And let me tell you, if it's necessary to quarantine 23 million people, well, then you've got a real bad situation on your hands. I mean, think about this whole Chinese pig virus that was getting spread around. I mean, China's already going through a rough time because of that with the high pork prices. If on top of this, you all of a sudden have people dropping dead, and I've seen some of the videos, guy just standing in the street and he just falls right over dead. Even if this doesn't affect the rest of the country, I mean, if you have all these folks in China, dropping like flies, it's going to create a lot of chaos with their economy. And of course, China now is much more important than they used to be economically. And I think that's why you're seeing the markets get spooked by this. Now that I think about it, there's some pretty bad stuff that's come out of China, as far as pandemics go in the last few years. I mean, not only did you have the whole SARS thing, you have this whole Chinese pig problem, you have now this new coronavirus, which I believe SARS is also a coronavirus. They're kind of the same family. I'm not a biologist, so I don't exactly know how all that works. And then you also had before that citrus greening, which is that disease that kills all of the orange trees, which I believe has affected, it's spread around the world to pretty much everywhere that oranges grow except for Brazil. And so perhaps we should expect now in the future that there are just going to be more and more diseases coming out of China. It could be, kind of like with Africa, that these diseases have existed all along. And it's just that as China becomes more developed and more integrated into the global economy, they're spreading these diseases. They're getting introduced into broader populations, and they're making their way sort of out of the jungle and out of the bush or out of whatever they call nature in China, and making their way into civilization. When it came to AIDS, I believe that the way that AIDS made its way out of the jungles in the Congo was that they paved a road from, they had this big infrastructure project to pave a road from one end of the country to the other. And, the workers who were, working on the road all along the way would patronize the local prostitutes, and the AIDS virus had existed in this local area for quite some time. It had never gotten out, and so these construction workers got AIDS, who were not from the area, got AIDS from the local prostitutes, and then spread it outside of that community into the broader Congo, and then the Congolese men spread it, and women spread it outside of the Congo. And so it's quite likely that there are plenty of very dangerous viruses that are lurking in the shadows, that are already existing, that are already affecting probably humans, that we just don't know about because the world's not so well connected. And so I guess as globalization carries on, we should expect more and more of these viruses and things and these illnesses to start coming up, for these pandemics to start happening, because they can spread a lot faster now than they ever could. And the people who are potentially affected include the entire planet. Frankly, I think that whatever we're seeing coming out of China when it comes to all these diseases, I'm surprised that we haven't seen more. But perhaps that's because the development of China has occurred in such a geographically small area. If you look at on a map the parts of China that really have benefited from all of the economic growth over the last 50 years or so, it's mostly the east coast of China. The interior is still, I guess, largely isolated from the rest of the world. And so there's plenty of chance, as the rest of China and Africa it begins to become more developed and integrated into the global economy, that there will be, like I said, still more of these viruses discovered. And of course, there's always the potential for any one of those to be, the one big one that is the next bubonic plague. The disease that wipes out a significant portion of the human population. It's been many hundred years since we've had some kind of massive pandemic like that that's wiped out a portion of the population and really set the world, or certain parts of the world, back a few centuries. And so it poetically would be quite intriguing to have some massive pandemic like that kills perhaps billions of people right at the time when we have this whole synchronized global growth narrative. Not that I'm hoping for that or anything. Obviously, it would be terrible for billions of people to die. But when we're talking about that sort of pandemic, that the big one that people are always worried about, that certain biologists say that we're overdue for, kind of like how certain geologists say that Yellowstone is overdue to erupt. It's going to erupt any day now, and then it's going to be the apocalypse, which that's obviously not quite true. But big things like that, they can be fun to think about and fun to talk about, but also pretty scary if it actually ever happened. Considering the way things have gone over the last few decades and few centuries, I'd say that our odds are pretty good that we're going to be just fine in our lifetimes, but one day I think it's safe to say that one of these viruses are going to be the big one, and there is going to be some mass extinction event. Oh, not extinction, I shouldn't say that. Mass casualty epidemic, or pandemic as they like to call them. Because even if you look at this coronavirus thing, it's not so much that everyone who gets it is going to die. Right now, I think the death rate is only like 8%, which is really high for diseases, but that's because we've gotten so good at treating people. But even still, even if only 8% of people are dying from it, until they find some kind of cure, if they can't control the spread of it, well, 8% of whoever gets it, let's say 1 million people catch it, that's 80,000 people that will have died from this. And let's say it spreads around the world and millions of people get it. Well, then that's, hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions that end up dying, depending on, how far this spreads. So anyway, I'm still not going to worry too much about it, but it is interesting that our betters, the various government agencies and things around the world are trying to calm people down about this. And so that does make me think that certainly the situation must be worse than they're letting on. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.